Chapter 1. Introductory. The defining principle toward which all arguments in this volume converge is the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity. This work is dedicated to the beloved and deplored memory of the author's wife, who was the inspirer and often the partial author of his best writings. Her exalted sense of truth and right was the strongest incitement for the work, and her approbation was its chief reward. The text belongs as much to her as to the author, though it lacks the inestimable advantage of her final revision, leaving the author to interpret to the world the great thoughts and noble feelings buried in her grave. The subject at hand is not the metaphysical concept of the liberty of the will, but rather civil or social liberty, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. It is a question that, while largely latent in the practical controversies of the age, is likely to become the vital question of the future, requiring a fundamental treatment different from how it has been approached in the remotest ages. The history of this subject is defined by the struggle between liberty and authority. In ancient times, particularly in Greece, Rome, and England, this contest was between subjects and the government. Liberty was understood as protection against the tyranny of political rulers, who were conceived as holding a necessary but antagonistic position toward the people. To prevent the weaker members of the community from being preyed upon by innumerable vultures, it was necessary to commission a bird of prey stronger than the rest to keep them down. However, since the king of the vultures was just as likely to prey on the flock as the minor harpies, the aim of patriots was to set limits to the power the ruler could exercise. This limitation was what was meant by liberty, achieved first through political immunities or rights and later through constitutional checks. Over time, human progress led to the belief that governors should not be an independent power, but rather tenants or delegates of the people, revocable at their pleasure. The demand for elective and temporary rulers superseded the effort to merely limit power, as it was thought that the nation did not need to be protected against its own will. However, success in establishing popular government disclosed a new reality. The people who exercise power are not always the same people over whom it is exercised. The will of the people practically means the will of the most numerous or active part of the people, the majority. The majority may desire to oppress a part of their number, giving rise to the tyranny of the majority, an evil that society must guard against. This tyranny is not limited to the acts of political functionaries. Society itself can be a tyrant, executing its own mandates and penetrating much deeper into the details of life than civil penalties ever could, thereby enslaving the soul. Protection against the magistrate is not enough. There must also be protection against the tyranny of prevailing opinion and feeling, which seeks to impose its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on dissenters, fettering the development of any individuality, not in harmony with its ways. Finding the limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence is indispensable to a good condition of human affairs. There is currently no recognized principle by which the propriety of government or social interference is tested. People decide according to their personal preferences, often believing that their feelings on a subject are better than reasons. The practical principle guiding opinions on the regulation of human conduct is the feeling in each person's mind that everyone should be required to act as he and his sympathizers would like them to act. These opinions are influenced by reason, prejudice, superstition, social affections, envy, arrogance, and most commonly, self-interest. Wherever there is an ascendant class, the morality of the country emanates from its class interests and feelings of superiority. Even among those who have advanced beyond society in thought and feeling, the principle of intolerance has rarely been assailed, except in the matter of religious belief. The great writers to whom the world owes religious liberty have mostly asserted freedom of conscience as an indefeasible right, yet intolerance remains natural to mankind in whatever they really care about. The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle to govern the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control. The sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. A person cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, or because it will make him happier, or because others think it wise or right. These are good reasons for remonstrating or reasoning with him, but not for compelling him. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. This doctrine applies only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties, excluding children and those in backward states of society where the race itself may be considered in its non-age. For such undeveloped societies, despotism is a legitimate mode of government, provided the end is their improvement. But once mankind has attained the capacity of being improved by free and equal discussion, compulsion is no longer admissible as a means to their own good. Utility is the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. These interests authorize the subjection of individual spontaneity to external control only regarding actions that concern the interest of others. If anyone does an act hurtful to others, there is a prima facie case for punishment by law or general disapprobation. There are also positive acts for the benefit of others that a person may be rightfully compelled to perform, such as giving evidence in court or saving a fellow creature's life, for a person may cause evil to others by his inaction as well as his action. However, there is a sphere of action in which society has only an indirect interest, comprehending all that affects only the individual or others with their free consent. This is the appropriate region of human liberty. This region of liberty comprises, first, the inward domain of consciousness, demanding liberty of conscience, thought, and feeling, and absolute freedom of opinion on all subjects. The liberty of expressing and publishing opinions is practically inseparable from this. Secondly, it includes the liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, and of doing as we like without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as we do not harm them. Thirdly, it includes the liberty of combination among individuals for any purpose not involving harm to others. No society in which these liberties are not respected is free, regardless of its form of government. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily, mental, or spiritual. Mankind gains more by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. Despite the apparent truism of this doctrine, it stands directly opposed to the general tendency of existing opinion and practice, which seeks to compel people to conform to social notions of excellence. Ancient commonwealths and philosophers believed the state had a deep interest in the whole bodily and mental discipline of its citizens, a view admissible in small, vulnerable republics, but dangerous in large modern nations. However, the engines of moral repression are now wielded strenuously against divergence from reigning opinion. Religion and the spirit of Puritanism have sought control over every department of human conduct. There is an increasing inclination in the world to stretch the powers of society over the individual, strengthening society and diminishing the power of the individual. This disposition is so energetically supported by both the best and worst feelings of human nature that it is likely to increase unless a strong barrier of moral conviction is raised against it. This introductory chapter establishes the foundational argument of the entire work, moving beyond abstract metaphysics to the practical realities of civil existence and defining the specific boundaries where social authority must yield to individual sovereignty. It sets the stage for a detailed examination of the first and most vital of these liberties, the liberty of thought and discussion, by framing the preservation of diverse, independent character as the essential condition for human progress and the only safeguard against the stagnation of collective mediocrity. Chapter 2 of the liberty of thought and discussion, the era in which it was necessary to defend the liberty of the press as a safeguard against corrupt or tyrannical government has, one hopes, largely passed. It is now generally accepted in constitutional countries that a government, whether responsible to the people or not, has no right to control the expression of opinion unless it acts as the organ of the general intolerance of the public. However, the central issue extends beyond the mere relationship between a government and its subjects. It touches upon the very legitimacy of the power of coercion itself. Even if a government were entirely at one with the people and never attempted to exert power except in agreement with the popular voice, such power would still be illegitimate. The best government has no more title to it than the worst, for the power to silence opinion is a robbery committed against the human race, against posterity as well as the existing generation, and arguably more against those who dissent than those who hold the opinion. If the silenced opinion is right, humanity is deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose an almost equal benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. To understand the gravity of this issue, one must consider two distinct hypotheses. First, that the opinion attempted to be suppressed may possibly be true, and second, that it may be false. To refuse a hearing to an opinion because one is sure it is false is to assume that one's own certainty is the same as absolute infallibility. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility, a dangerous stance given that while everyone knows they are fallible in theory, few take precautions against it in practice. Men tend to rely implicitly on the infallibility of the world, which to each individual means merely their own party, sect, or class. Yet it is evident that ages are no more infallible than individuals, as every age has held opinions which subsequent ages have deemed not only false, but absurd. History teems with tragic instances where the arm of the law was employed to root out the best men and the noblest doctrines under the guise of protecting society from error. Socrates, the acknowledged master of all eminent thinkers and a man of unblemished virtue, was put to death by his countrymen for impiety and immorality, judicially convicted by a tribunal that honestly believed him guilty. Similarly, the event on Calvary saw the man who left such an impression of moral grandeur that 18 centuries have done him homage, ignominiously executed as a blasphemer. These were not the acts of evil men, but of those who possessed the full measure of the religious, moral, and patriotic feelings of their time. Even Marcus Aurelius, the absolute monarch of the civilized world and a man of the tenderest heart and most unblemished justice, authorized the persecution of Christianity. He did so not from cruelty, but from a solemn sense of duty, believing that society was held together by the existing divinities and that Christianity aimed to dissolve these ties. If such a man, with his enlightened intellect, could make such a mistake, no one today can claim the infallibility required to decide that an opinion is noxious and must be suppressed. It is often argued that truth always triumphs over persecution, but this is a pleasant falsehood refuted by experience. History is filled with examples of truth being put down by persecution. The Reformation broke out at least 20 times before Luther and was suppressed. In Spain, Italy, and Flanders, Protestantism was rooted out. Persecution has always succeeded, save where the heretics were too strong to be effectually persecuted. The real advantage of truth is not that it has an inherent power to prevail against the dungeon and the stake, but that when an opinion is true, it may be extinguished once or many times, yet in the course of ages, there will generally be found persons to rediscover it until it falls on a time when favorable circumstances allow it to escape persecution. However, even if the received opinion is not only true, but the whole truth, it must still be vigorously contested, or it will be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension of its rational grounds. Without free discussion, the meaning of the doctrine itself is in danger of being lost or enfeebled, becoming a mere formal profession efficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of real conviction. This is evident in the way many hold the doctrines of Christianity. They accept the maxims as sacred laws, but conduct their lives according to the customs of their nation or class. The sayings of Christ coexist passively in their minds, possessing no power to govern their conduct because they are never challenged or discussed. In the early days of Christianity, when the faith was fighting for its existence, the meaning of the creed was lively and potent. When a creed becomes hereditary and is received passively, it often happens that the mind is no longer compelled to exercise its vital powers on the questions the belief presents, and the belief remains outside the mind, encrusting and petrifying it against other influences. Furthermore, it is rare that the truth belongs solely to one side of a debate. More often, the conflicting doctrines share the truth between them, and the nonconforming opinion is needed to supply the remainder of the truth. Popular opinions are often true but seldom the whole truth. They are generally one-sided and exaggerated. Heretical opinions, conversely, often contain the suppressed and neglected truths that the popular opinion ignores. For example, in the 18th century, the paradoxes of Rousseau exploded like bombshells in the midst of the compact mass of one-sided opinion, forcing the elements of thought to recombine in a better form. In politics, it is almost a commonplace that a party of order and a party of progress are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. Unless opinions favorable to democracy and aristocracy, equality and property, cooperation and competition are expressed with equal freedom and enforced with equal talent, there is no chance of both elements obtaining their due. Therefore, the mental well-being of mankind, on which all other well-being depends, requires freedom of opinion and freedom of the expression of opinion on four distinct grounds. First, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may be true, and to deny this is to assume infallibility. Second, though the silenced opinion be an error, it may and very commonly does contain a portion of truth, which is necessary to correct the partiality of the prevailing opinion. Third, even if the received opinion be the whole truth, unless it is contested, it will be held as a prejudice rather than a rational conviction. Fourth, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct. Finally, regarding the manner of discussion, it is often argued that the free expression of opinion should be permitted only if the manner is temperate and avoids invective. However, this standard is usually applied unfairly. The denunciation of intemperate discussion is mostly used to restrain the minority or those attacking the prevailing opinion, while those who defend the received opinion may employ every weapon of vituperation without rebuke. The worst offense that can be committed by a polemic is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. This is a weapon to those who attack a prevailing opinion, as they must use studied moderation to obtain a hearing at all. The real morality of public discussion lies in giving merited honor to every one, whatever opinion they may hold, who has the calmness to see and the honesty to state what his opponents and their opinions really are, neither exaggerating anything to their discredit nor keeping back anything which tells in their favor. Having established that the liberty of thought and discussion is not merely a political right, but a fundamental necessity for the intellectual and moral health of humanity, the argument naturally progresses to the practical application of these principles in the realm of action. The recognition of individual judgment in the sphere of the mind sets the stage for determining how far this independence should extend to the conduct of life itself, and where the boundary between individual sovereignty and social control must ultimately be drawn. Chapter 3 of Individuality as one of the elements of well-being. Having established the absolute necessity of the liberty of thought and discussion, it remains to be seen whether these same reasons do not also demand that men be free to act upon their opinions. It is undeniable that actions cannot be as free as opinions. Even opinions lose their immunity when their expression constitutes a positive instigation to some mischievous act. An opinion that private property is robbery, for instance, ought to be unmolested when circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment if delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer. The liberty of the individual must be limited by this single proviso: he must not make himself a nuisance to other people. However, if he refrains from molesting others in what concerns them, and merely acts according to his own inclination and judgment in things which concern himself, the same reasons which show that opinions should be free prove also that he should be allowed to carry his opinions into practice at his own cost. Just as it is useful that there should be different opinions while mankind is imperfect, so is it that there should be different experiments of living. Free scope should be given to varieties of character, short of injury to others, for the worth of different modes of life is best proved practically. In things which do not primarily concern others, individuality should assert itself. For where the traditions or customs of others are the rule of conduct, there is wanting one of the principal ingredients of human happiness, and quite the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. The greatest difficulty in maintaining this principle lies in the indifference of persons in general to the end itself. Most people, being satisfied with the ways of mankind as they now are, cannot comprehend why those ways should not be good enough for everybody. Individual spontaneity is hardly recognized by the common modes of thinking as having any intrinsic worth. Yet, as Wilhelm von Humboldt asserted, the end of man is the highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole, and for this, freedom and variety of situations are indispensable. From the union of these arise individual vigor and manifold diversity, which combine themselves in originality. It is not suggested that people should do nothing but copy one another, nor that they should live as if the world had known nothing before they came into it, but it is the privilege of a human being, arrived at the maturity of his faculties, to use and interpret experience in his own way. He who does anything because it is the custom makes no choice. He gains no practice either in discerning or in desiring what is best. The mental and moral powers, like the muscular powers, are improved only by being used. He who lets the world choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. There is a prevalent fear that strong impulses and desires are a peril, yet desires and impulses are as much a part of a perfect human being as beliefs and restraints. Strong impulses are only perilous when not properly balanced. It is not because men's desires are strong that they act ill, but because their consciences are weak. Strong impulses are but another name for energy, and more good may always be made of an energetic nature than of an indolent one. In early states of society, the difficulty was to induce men of strong bodies or minds to pay obedience to any rules. Law and discipline then asserted a power over the whole man. But society has now fairly got the better of individuality, and the danger which threatens human nature is not the excess, but the deficiency of personal impulses and preferences. In our times, everyone lives as under the eye of a hostile censorship. People ask themselves what is suitable to their station or what is customary, until by dint of not following their own nature, they have no nature to follow. Their human capacities are withered and starved. They become incapable of any strong wishes or native pleasures. This repression aligns with the Calvinistic theory, which views self-will as the one great offense of man and obedience as the whole of good. According to this view, human nature is radically corrupt and must be killed within. But if it be any part of religion to believe that man was made by a good being, it is consistent to believe that this being gave all human faculties that they might be cultivated and unfolded, not rooted out and consumed. There is a Greek ideal of self-development, which the Platonic and Christian ideal of self-government blends with, but does not supersede. It is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it within the limits imposed by the rights of others, that human beings become noble and beautiful objects of contemplation. By the same process, human life becomes rich and animating, strengthening the tie which binds every individual to the race by making the race infinitely better worth belonging to. Even despotism does not produce its worst effects so long as individuality exists under it, and whatever crushes individuality is despotism, by whatever name it may be called. However, these considerations will not suffice to convince those who most need convincing, unless it can be shown that these developed human beings are of some use to the undeveloped. It will not be denied that originality is a valuable element in human affairs. There is always need of persons not only to discover new truths, but to commence new practices and set the example of more enlightened conduct. These few are the salt of the earth. Without them, human life would become a stagnant pool. Persons of genius are, by definition, more individual than any other people, less capable of fitting themselves into the small number of molds which society provides. If they are of a strong character and break their fetters, they become a mark for society to point at with solemn warning as wild or erratic, much as if one should complain of the Niagara River for not flowing smoothly like a Dutch canal. The general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power. In politics, public opinion now rules the world, which practically means the opinion of collective mediocrity. The counterpoise to this tendency would be the more pronounced individuality of those who stand on the higher eminences of thought. Precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach, it is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement. The greater part of the world has, properly speaking, no history, because the despotism of custom is complete. This is the case over the whole East. We have a warning example in China, a nation of much talent and wisdom, which has become stationary and has remained so for thousands of years. If they are ever to be further improved, it must be by foreigners. Europe has hitherto been preserved from this fate not by any superior excellence, but by its remarkable diversity of character and culture. But Europe is decidedly advancing toward the Chinese ideal of making all people alike. All the political changes of the age, the extension of education, the improvements in communication, and the increase of commerce promote this assimilation. The combination of all these causes forms so great a mass of influences hostile to individuality that it is not easy to see how it can stand its ground. If the claims of individuality are ever to be asserted, the time is now, while much is still wanting to complete the enforced assimilation. If resistance waits until life is reduced nearly to one uniform type, all deviation from that type will come to be considered impious, immoral, even monstrous, and contrary to nature. This chapter marks the pivotal transition from the internal freedom of the mind to the external freedom of action, arguing that the diversity of human character is not merely a private luxury, but the engine of all social progress. By establishing individuality as the necessary counterforce to the stagnating weight of custom and collective mediocrity, the discussion prepares the ground for the subsequent inquiry into the specific limits of societal authority, setting the stage to define exactly where the rights of the individual end and the rights of the public begin. Chapter 4 of the limits to the authority of society over the individual. The inquiry into the nature of liberty inevitably leads to the fundamental question of boundaries. Where does the sovereignty of the individual over himself end, and where does the authority of society begin? The answer lies in the assignment of specific spheres of human life to the powers most interested in them. To individuality belongs that part of life in which the individual is chiefly interested. To society belongs the part which chiefly interests society. While society is not founded upon a contract, and inventing one serves no purpose, the very fact of living within a community implies a return for the protection it affords. Consequently, every individual is bound to observe a certain line of conduct toward the rest. This conduct consists, first, in not injuring the interests of one another, specifically those interests which, by law or tacit understanding, are considered rights, and secondly, in bearing an equitable share of the labors and sacrifices necessary for defending the society or its members from injury. These are conditions that society is justified in enforcing at all costs. Furthermore, acts that may not violate specific rights but still hurt others or show a lack of due consideration may be justly punished by opinion, if not by law. However, as soon as a person's conduct affects only himself, or affects others only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent, there should be perfect freedom, legal and social, to perform the action and stand by the consequences. It would be a grave misunderstanding to view this doctrine as one of selfish indifference, suggesting that human beings should have no concern for each other's well-being. On the contrary, there is a desperate need for disinterested exertion to promote the good of others. But this benevolence must find instruments other than whips and scourges, literal or metaphorical. Society has a duty to educate and encourage the self-regarding virtues, but it has no warrant to tell a human creature of ripe years that he shall not do with his life, for his own benefit, what he chooses. The individual is the person most interested in his own well-being. The interest society has in him individually is fragmentary and indirect. Society's interference to overrule his judgment in matters regarding himself alone is likely to be grounded on general presumptions that are often wrong or misapplied. Therefore, in this department of human affairs, individuality has its proper field of action. Others may offer advice, warnings, or even obtrude considerations upon him, but he must be the final judge. The errors he is likely to commit against advice are far outweighed by the evil of allowing others to constrain him to what they deem his good. This does not mean that a person's self-regarding faults should not affect the feelings of others toward him. If a person displays rashness, obstinacy, self-conceit, or pursues animal pleasures at the expense of feeling and intellect, he must expect to be lowered in the opinion of others. This constitutes a natural penalty, a spontaneous consequence of the fault itself, rather than a punishment purposely inflicted by society. We have a right to avoid such a person and to caution others against him, but we do not have the right to make his life uncomfortable as a form of retribution. He is an object of pity, perhaps dislike, but not of anger or resentment. The distinction here is critical. If he infringes on the rights of others, he is an offender subject to moral reprobation and punishment. If his faults are merely personal, the worst we should do is leave him to himself. The most common objection to this limitation of social authority is the argument that no person is entirely isolated. Any serious injury to oneself inevitably affects others and diminishes the general resources of the community. If a man destroys his bodily faculties or his property, he brings evil upon those dependent on him, and perhaps becomes a burden on public benevolence. However, when such conduct violates a distinct and assignable obligation to any other person or persons, the case is taken out of the self-regarding class and becomes amenable to moral disapprobation. If a man, through intemperance, cannot pay his debts or support his family, he is blameworthy for the breach of duty, not the extravagance itself. But where there is no violation of specific duty to the public or individuals, the inconvenience society sustains is one which it can afford to bear for the sake of the greater good of human freedom. If society seeks to prevent such contingent injuries, It should have done so earlier through education. If society has failed to make its members capable of rational conduct during their childhood and non-age, it has only itself to blame. To confer upon society the power to issue commands in personal concerns is to invite the tyranny of the majority, for in these matters, public opinion essentially means some people's opinion of what is good or bad for other people. History and current events abound with examples of the moral police extending the bounds of social authority improperly. The strongest argument against public interference in personal conduct is that when it does interfere, the odds are that it interferes wrongly and in the wrong place. The public considers its own preference as a moral law. This is evident in the antipathy men cherish toward religious practices different from their own, such as the Muslim aversion to eating pork. If a Muslim majority insisted on banning pork within their country, they would be exercising the same moral authority that Christians often claim in banning amusements or habits they find offensive. The principle is identical. If we are not willing to accept the logic of persecutors, that they may persecute because they are right, we must beware of admitting a principle that applies to ourselves as much as to them. This tendency to extend moral policing is visible in modern movements like the prohibition of alcohol, Sabbatarian legislation, and the persecution of Mormons. The argument often used, that one's social rights are invaded by the mere existence of a vice or disorder in society, is a monstrous principle that destroys all liberty. It claims that every individual has a vested interest in the moral perfection of every other, granting the public a right to veto any conduct it disapproves of. Under this theory, the Alliance Against Alcohol claims the traffic in strong drink invades their right to security and moral development. Similarly, Sabbatarians seek to ban Sunday amusements, not because they are forced to participate, but because they believe the act is religiously wrong. Even in the case of Mormon polygamy, an institution that may be viewed with deep disapprobation, so long as the women involved are voluntary participants and the community commits no aggression against other nations, there is no justification for the civilized world to send expeditions to force conformity. A civilization that cannot withstand the mere existence of a barbarous practice in a remote corner of the earth has likely already become so degenerate that it receives notice to quit. This chapter concludes the examination of the theoretical boundaries of liberty by illustrating how easily the tyranny of the majority can manifest as a demand for moral uniformity by insisting that the only rightful grounds for coercion are self-protection and the prevention of harm to others. The argument erects a barrier against the encroachments of public opinion, which seeks to legislate personal taste and private morality. This sets the stage for the final phase of the inquiry, which will apply these established maxims to concrete problems of government and society, testing the practical application of the doctrine of liberty in the complex realities of daily life. Chapter 5: Applications. The principles of liberty and individuality, having been established in the abstract, must now be tested against the complexities of practical life to determine the proper boundaries between the sovereignty of the individual and the authority of society. The doctrine rests on two fundamental maxims. First, that the individual is not accountable to society for actions that concern no one but himself, with society's only recourse being advice, instruction, or avoidance. And second, that for actions prejudicial to the interests of others, the individual is accountable and subject to social or legal punishment if necessary for the public protection. However, the application of these maxims is not always straightforward, particularly because injury to others does not always justify interference. In the competitive arenas of life, such as professional advancement or examinations, one person's success inevitably causes pain or loss to another, yet society admits no right to immunity from this suffering, intervening only when the means employed, such as fraud or force, are contrary to the general interest. The realm of trade presents a distinct challenge, for commerce is inherently a social act that affects the interests of others, placing it within the jurisdiction of society. While the doctrine of free trade rests on the economic realization that leaving production and sales unrestricted produces the best results, this is a matter of utility rather than individual liberty. Restrictions on trade are restraints and thus evils, but they are not violations of the principle of liberty in the same sense as restrictions on personal conduct. However, when the government attempts to prohibit the sale of commodities, such as alcohol or opium, not to regulate commerce but to make it impossible for individuals to obtain them, it crosses the line into an infringement of the liberty of the buyer. Similarly, the preventive function of government, or the police power, carries a high risk of abuse. While a public officer may forcibly stop a man from crossing an unsafe bridge because the man presumably does not wish to fall into the river, in cases where the danger is not certain, the individual must be left to judge the risk for himself after being warned. In the sale of potential instruments of crime, such as poisons, the state may enforce precautions like labeling or registration, pre-appointed evidence, to deter misuse without prohibiting the legitimate liberty of the purchaser. The distinction between self-regarding faults and social crimes remains pivotal when addressing behaviors like drunkenness or idleness. These are not fit subjects for legal punishment unless they lead to a breach of specific duties to others. A soldier may be punished for drunkenness on duty, or a father for idleness if it causes him to fail in supporting his children, but the personal conduct itself remains outside the law's reach. A more complex boundary exists regarding public decency. Acts permissible in private may become violations of good manners when done publicly, justifying their prohibition. Furthermore, the question arises whether society should restrict those who instigate others to vice for profit, such as pimps or keepers of gambling houses. While the arguments are balanced, the principle of liberty generally favors allowing individuals to make their own choices, even if solicited, though society may legitimately restrict the public and commercial aspects of such enterprises to maintain order without infringing on privacy. The concept of liberty also demands that individuals maintain the power to alter their own course, meaning that engagements and contracts must not become chains that permanently bind a person against their future will. The extreme example is the contract of slavery. A man cannot voluntarily sell himself into slavery because doing so alienates the very freedom that justifies his right to choose. The principle of freedom cannot require that one be free to be not free. This logic extends to marriage, which should not be a bond enforced by law at the cost of the happiness of the parties, though the existence of children introduces a new set of moral obligations. Indeed, the state often neglects its duty to protect those unable to protect themselves, particularly within the family. The almost despotic power of husbands over wives and the absolute control parents exercise over children are areas where the sentiment of liberty is often misplaced. The state is bound to compel the education of every child to ensure they can function as citizens, yet it must not monopolize that education. To do so would be to mold the mind of the populace into a uniform shape pleasing to the dominant power. Rather, the state should enforce educational standards through public examinations while allowing diverse methods of instruction to flourish. Finally, there remains a class of government interference that does not infringe on liberty, but is objectionable on other grounds. When the state performs tasks that individuals could do better, or tasks that individuals should do for their own mental development. Government activity, even when beneficial, carries the grave danger of expanding the state's power unnecessarily. The absorption of the nation's talent into a massive bureaucracy creates a pedantocracy that stifles progress and renders the populace dependent and passive, as seen in the political stagnancy of nations where the state manages all collective affairs. To avoid this, the ideal arrangement is the greatest dissemination of power consistent with efficiency, coupled with the greatest centralization of information. By fostering independent activity and local administration while serving as a central repository of experience, the state aids the development of its citizens rather than dwarfing them, ensuring that the vitality of the nation is not sacrificed to the perfection of its administrative machinery. This concluding chapter transforms the philosophical abstractions of the previous arguments into a concrete guide for governance, demarcating the precise threshold where legitimate state protection ends and bureaucratic tyranny begins. By applying the principles of liberty to trade, family, education, and administration, it serves as the final blueprint for a society that balances the necessary cohesion of the collective with the indispensable flourishing of the individual spirit. Earliest period of mature thought, one that has not weakened, but rather grown stronger with the progress of reflection and the experience of life. The thesis is that the principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of... While these words may sound sharp and decisive, the difficulty in making them heard is immense, for the cause is contending against a mass of feeling that overpowers judgment. When an opinion rests on intuition or sentiment rather than argument, it is often immune to logic. The more it is challenged, the deeper its roots grow, as its defenders retreat into the instincts of their nature rather than the faculties of their reason. The burden of proof in this matter is unfairly distributed. By all the laws of logic, those who assert that the liberty and opportunity allowed to one half of the human species should be denied to the other ought to be the ones to justify this exclusion. The presumption of modern life is in favor of freedom and impartiality. The law no longer determines who can do what work or hold what station based on birth or caste, except in this one singular instance. The subordination of women stands out as an isolated fact in modern social institutions, a solitary breach of what has become the fundamental law of human progress. It is a relic of an older world, a single dissonant note in a civilization that has otherwise moved toward the removal of inherited disabilities. However, the universality of this custom is cited as proof of its validity, an argument that relies on the assumption that this arrangement is the result of the collective wisdom and experience of mankind. This assumption, however, is historically false. The subjection of women did not arise from a trial of different social modes to determine which was most conducive to human happiness. It arose simply from the fact that from the very earliest twilight of human society, every woman was found in a state of bondage to some man. This was not a result of deliberation or forethought, but the direct application of the law of the strongest. In primitive times, physical force was the only law. Men took women by force, and over centuries, this physical fact was converted into a legal right. What began as the brutality of the club evolved into the sanctity of the law, just as slavery did. The fact that this system has endured does not prove its utility, but only that the law of force has not yet been fully abandoned in the most intimate of human relations. The transition from a law of force to a law of justice is recent and fragile in human history, and the relationship between men and women remains the last stronghold of the primitive rule of might. It is often argued that the rule of men over women is different from other forms of domination because it is accepted voluntarily. Women, it is said, do not complain and are consenting parties to it. But this is a misunderstanding of the nature of power and resistance. A great number of women do protest through their writings and their actions, and many more would if they were not silenced by the fear of social or domestic retribution. Furthermore, the kind of obedience required of women is unique. Men do not want solely the obedience of women. They want their sentiments. All men, except the most brutish, desire to have in the woman most nearly connected with them, not a forced slave, but a willing one, not a slave merely, but a favorite. They have therefore put everything in practice to enslave their minds. The masters of all other slaves rely, for maintaining obedience, on fear. The masters of women want more. Consequently, the whole force of education has been turned to the purpose of training women to believe that it is their nature to live for others, to make complete abnegation of themselves, and to have no life but in their affections. Because of this overwhelming social conditioning, what is called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions and unnatural stimulation in others. It is absurd to argue that the current state of women is natural when no one can say what women would be if they were allowed to develop freely. We can no more determine the true nature of a woman in her present state of subjection than we could determine the true nature of a tree that has been grown with one half of it kept in a steam bath and the other half in the snow. What is now called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing. Men have, effectively, kept women in a hothouse of sentiment while barring them from the hardening and strengthening influences of the world. and then they point to the resulting fragility as proof of an innate incapacity. Ultimately, the question is not about what women can or cannot do, but about justice. We cannot know what women are fit for because we have never allowed them to try. If the current system is as natural and beneficial as its defenders claim, it should not require a complex structure of laws and prohibitions to maintain it. The anxiety of mankind to interfere on behalf of nature for fear that nature should not succeed in effecting its purpose is an altogether unnecessary solicitude. If it is in the nature of women to be subordinate, they will remain so in a system of perfect liberty. If it is not, then the current system is merely a tyranny that deprives humanity of the contributions of half its members. The time has come to apply the principles of justice to the relationship between the sexes, to remove the legal and social barriers that have stifled women's potential, and to allow the true nature of humanity, in both its male and female forms, to emerge in a state of freedom. This sets the stage for a detailed examination of how this subjection operates in marriage, in society, and in the professional world, and why its removal is a necessary step for the advancement of the human race. Chapter 7. The subjection of with the inequality of the sexes are among the most intense and deeply rooted, gathering around them a protective layer of old institutions and customs that have largely resisted the dissolving influence of modern social progress. The burden of proof in this matter is unjustly distributed. In almost any other case, the burden lies with those who restrict liberty or impose disabilities, as the presumption is always in favor of freedom and impartiality. However, in the case of women, the accuser must not only answer all arguments on the other side, but also imagine and refute all potential arguments, and is essentially required to prove a negative. Those who maintain that men have a right to command and women are under an obligation to obey rely on the universality of the practice and the general sentiment of mankind. Yet this universal custom affords no presumption in its favor, for it did not arise from a conscientious comparison of different social modes to determine which was best for humanity. Rather, it originated in the primitive twilight of society from the law of the strongest. In early history, physical strength was the only rule. Women, physically weaker and valued by men, were held in a state of bondage. Over time, this mere physical fact was converted into a legal right, sanctioned by society and protected by organized public means, replacing the irregular conflict of physical strength with legal forms. While humanity has largely moved away from the law of force in other domains, abolishing slavery and absolute monarchy in favor of justice and equal rights, the relation between men and women remains a singular exception, a relic of an old world preserved within the new. This survival is not due to its inherent fitness, but because the desire for power is strongest when exercised over those nearest to us. Unlike political tyranny, which affects only a few, the mastership of men over women comes home to every male head of a family, making the resistance to change immensely powerful. The system is further entrenched because each subject lives under the very eye of her master, in closer intimacy with him than with any fellow subject, preventing collective rebellion. Thus, the inequality of rights has no other source than the law of the strongest, a principle that the modern world has otherwise ostensibly abandoned. It is often argued that this rule is different because it is accepted voluntarily. Women, it is said, do not complain and are consenting parties. This is factually incorrect, as evidenced by the increasing number of women who protest through writings, petitions, and organized movements for education and suffrage. Furthermore, no enslaved class ever demands complete liberty at once. They begin by protesting specific abuses. Moreover, the masters of women require more than simple obedience. They desire the sentiments of those they govern. They do not want a forced slave, but a willing one, and consequently, the entire force of education has been directed toward enslaving the minds of women. They are brought up to believe that their ideal character is the opposite of men's, not self-will and government by self-control, but submission and yielding to the control of others. By combining the natural attraction between the sexes with the wife's total dependence on the husband, men have ensured that the object of being attractive to men becomes the polar star of feminine education, binding women to their subjection, through their own affections. Consequently, what is commonly called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions and unnatural stimulation in others. It is impossible to know the true nature of the two sexes as long as they have only been seen in their present relation. If one half of a tree were kept in a vapor bath and the other half in the snow, one would hardly look at the resulting stunted or luxuriant growth and claim it as the tree's nature. Similarly, men have kept women in a hothouse of sentiment while depriving them of the hardening influences of the world, and then point to the result as proof of innate incapacity. History shows that nature is often just a label for custom. Greeks thought slavery was natural, and feudal nobles thought their dominion over commoners was natural. Until women are allowed free development and equal opportunity, any assertion about their natural abilities or disabilities is mere conjecture based on distorted evidence. The current social subordination of women stands out as an isolated fact in modern social institutions, a solitary breach of the fundamental law that human beings should be free to employ their faculties to achieve their desired lot. In the modern world, we no longer fix people's social positions at birth, except for women. We do not legally bar a weak-armed man from being a blacksmith. We let the competition of the market decide. Yet, we forbid women from entering professions or competing for social functions based on a general presumption of unfitness, effectively depriving society of the contributions of half the human race. If the prohibition is based on the belief that women are naturally unfit, then the prohibition is unnecessary, for competition would naturally exclude them. The anxiety to forbid women from doing what they supposedly cannot do suggests a fear that they might actually succeed if given the chance. Ultimately, the argument that women must be compelled into marriage and motherhood because they would not otherwise accept it is equivalent to the logic of slaveholders or the old practice of impressing sailors. If the married state were made truly desirable and equal, there would be no need to close all other doors to force women into it. The fear that women would prefer a free and independent life over marriage suggests that the current terms of marriage are unattractive. By maintaining a system of injustice and claiming it is natural, society perpetuates a relic of barbarism that stands in direct contradiction to the progressive principles of the modern age. This opening chapter lays the philosophical and historical groundwork for the examination of gender inequality, dismantling the arguments of custom and nature to reveal the underlying law of force. It reorients the discussion from a defense of tradition to a demand for justice, setting the stage for a detailed analysis of how this subjection operates within marriage and society, and why the liberation of women is a necessary step for the moral and intellectual advancement of all humanity. Chapter 8. The details of the inquiry lead inevitably to the specific conditions which the laws of this options. Yet, history reveals that society has largely preferred to attain its objects by foul means rather than fair, and marriage remains the one case where the primitive reliance on force persists substantially to the present day. Originally, women were taken by force or sold by their fathers. While the church eventually required a formal yes at the altar, there was no evidence that such consent was anything other than compulsory, leaving women with no real alternative but the convent. Even after marriage, the husband historically held the power of life and death. The wife could invoke no law against him, for he was her sole tribunal. Despite the softening effects of civilization and Christianity, the wife remains the actual bondservant of her husband, legally bound to lifelong obedience. She can acquire no property for herself. The instant she inherits or earns anything, it belongs ipso facto to him. In this respect, the position of a wife under the common law of England is worse than that of slaves in many ancient codes, where a slave might at least possess a peculium for his exclusive use. While the upper classes have managed to shield some women through special settlements, these are rare exceptions. For the immense majority, there is no settlement, and the absorption of all rights, property, and freedom of action is absolute. The law declares them one person, a fiction used to infer that whatever is hers is his, but never that whatever is his is hers. This legal fusion does not apply to the husband, except to make him responsible for her acts as a master is for his slaves. In many regards, the wife's condition is more absolute than slavery. A slave has fixed duties and, when off duty, creates a private life into which the master rarely intrudes. A wife, however, has no time of her own. She is a bondservant at all hours. Moreover, a female slave has an admitted right to refuse the last familiarity to her master, whereas a wife, however brutal the tyrant she is chained to, cannot refuse. She can be compelled to endure the lowest degradation of a human being, serving as the instrument of an animal function contrary to her inclinations. Furthermore, her children, the shared interest of the partnership, are by law his alone. He can separate them from her, and even after his death, she is not their legal guardian unless he wills it. She cannot leave him. If she flees, she takes nothing, not even her children. Only a legal separation, difficult and expensive to obtain, can protect her from a jailer who may seize her earnings or compel her return. Thus, if a woman is denied any lot in life, but that of a personal body servant to a despot, it is a cruel aggravation that she is allowed to try this chance only once, with no opportunity to change masters, should the first prove a tyrant. Defenders of the status quo argue that actual treatment is rarely as bad as the law permits, and that the feelings of affection and shared interest usually temper the husband's power. This is true. If married life were all that the laws imply, society would be a hell on earth. However, laws are not made for the good, but for the bad. It is no justification of a tyranny to say that some tyrants are benevolent. The law allows the vilest malefactor to tie a wretched woman to him, subjecting her to every atrocity except murder, and even that carries little risk of legal penalty. In the lowest classes, thousands of men, who are little higher than brutes, are given absolute power over a victim who cannot escape. The excess of dependence inspires such savage natures not with generosity, but with the notion that the woman is a thing to be used at their pleasure. Even among common men, the violent and sulky sides of their character are reserved for the home, where they fear no resistance. The family, in such cases, becomes a nursery of vices, an overflowing source of willfulness and double-dyed selfishness. It is often asked how society could exist without a single ultimate ruler to decide when married people differ. Yet this necessity for an absolute master is not found in voluntary business partnerships, where responsibilities are divided and decisions negotiated without appointing one partner as the sovereign commander of the other. The law does not mandate that one business partner must obey the other. They define their own terms. In marriage, a natural division of powers would arise from individual capacities and suitabilities, modified by consent. The mere fact that the man is usually older or the primary earner would likely give him preponderance enough without the law tipping the scale so heavily in his favor. There is no need for a legal basis of despotism to resolve differences. Normally, natural motives and the desire for peace lead to compromise. The current system, which entitles one person to everything and the other to nothing, forces the subordinate partner into a state of moral and religious obligation to endure oppression, rather than fostering a union of equals. The equality of married persons before the law is the only mode consistent with justice and conducive to happiness. It is also the only means of rendering the daily life of mankind a school of moral cultivation. Currently, the family is often a school of despotism, fostering the vices of power in the man and the vices of submission in the woman. True virtue in human beings is fitness to live together as equals, claiming nothing for themselves that they do not concede to others. The family, justly constituted, would be the real school of the virtues of freedom, where obedience is required only of children and parents live in sympathetic equality. A man who lives surrounded by those he dominates cannot learn the genuine love of freedom. He learns only an intense appreciation of his own personality and a disdain for any yoke upon himself, while remaining abundantly ready to impose yokes upon others. Regarding property and occupation, it is essential that a woman's inheritance or gains be her own after marriage. The injustice of the current system, which allows a man to entrap a girl for her money or squander her earnings while he lives in idleness, is palpable. While the most suitable division of labor usually sees the man earning the income and the wife superintending the household, this should be a matter of choice, not legal compulsion. The power of earning is essential to the dignity of a woman. If marriage were an equal contract, not implying an obligation of obedience, and if separation were obtainable on just terms, women would not necessarily need to exercise the power of earning during marriage, but the option must exist. To forbid women from earning or managing their own property is to leave them defenseless and to maintain the last great relic of the law of force in a world that otherwise boasts of progress and justice. Until the law treats the wife as an independent moral being with rights equal to her husband, the institution of marriage will remain a contradiction to the principles of the modern world. This examination of the marriage contract reveals that the legal subordination of women is not a natural or necessary condition, but a remnant of a primitive struggle for power, preserved through custom and the selfishness of the stronger sex. By exposing the tyranny inherent in the current laws and the moral corruption it breeds within the family, the argument shifts toward the necessity of equality, not just for the sake of women, but for the moral elevation of men and the general advancement of society. Chapter 9. The Admissibility of Women to Public Functions. The inquiry into the condition of women naturally extends beyond the domestic sphere to the public realm, addressing the admissibility of women to all functions and occupations hitherto retained as the monopoly of the stronger sex. If the question of equality within the family is accepted, the injustice of excluding half the human race from the greater number of lucrative occupations and high social functions becomes glaringly apparent. The persistence of these disabilities in the outer world serves primarily to maintain subordination in the domestic life, for the generality of men cannot yet tolerate the idea of living with an equal. Were it not for this domestic tyranny, the injustice of ordaining that women are unfit for employment open to the dullest men would be universally recognized. In previous centuries, exclusion was justified by the interest of society, meaning the interest of men, much like the raison d'etat justified political crimes. Today, power speaks a smoother language, claiming that women are excluded for their own good to keep them from deviating from their natural path of happiness. Yet to maintain this, one must assert that women are naturally incapable of these pursuits, a claim contradicted by the fact that prohibitory laws are required to stop them. If women were truly unfit, the free play of competition would naturally exclude them without the need for legal interdiction. The argument that women are naturally inferior in mental capacity is refuted by the evidence of history, particularly regarding the one public function women have been allowed to hold, that of the sovereign. The history of reigning queens, from Elizabeth to Victoria, including regents and viceroys, demonstrates a capacity for government fully equal to that of men. It is often jokingly remarked that queens govern better than kings because under queens, men govern, while under kings, women govern. This jest unintentionally admits that women possess a superior capacity for selecting fit instruments of governance, which is the principal business of a ruler. Furthermore, history shows that queens have often retained supreme direction and have been well served precisely because their judgment fitted them for dealing with the great questions of state. If women are fit for the highest political function, it is unreasonable to argue they are unfit for the lesser offices of state or for the professions and occupations currently barred to them. Regarding the mental differences between the sexes, it is impossible to distinguish what is natural from what is the result of education and circumstance. Women's minds have been stunted like trees in a hothouse, forcing certain developments while repressing others. However, looking at women as they currently are, their supposed nervous susceptibility and mobility of mind are often cited as disqualifications for serious business. Yet, these very traits, quickness of apprehension and the ability to shift focus rapidly, are distinct advantages in practical life, where success depends on seeing the reality of the present moment rather than adhering to abstract theories. Men of speculation often fail in practice because they lack this intuitive grasp of facts, a quality in which women and men of similar temperament excel. What is termed nervous temperament is the source of high energy and concentrated effort. When disciplined, it produces the most passionate and constant characters. If men of this temperament are not disqualified from leadership, neither should women be. The objection that women have not produced works of the highest order in philosophy, science, or art, no Shakespeare, Mozart, or Raphael, is a matter of timing and opportunity. Women have only recently begun to cultivate these fields seriously, and even then, they have mostly been self-educated. High originality requires a thorough knowledge of what has come before, a foundation women have largely been denied. Moreover, the life of a woman is a constant interruption. She is expected to be at the beck and call of domestic duties and social expectations, leaving no contiguous time for the deep, sustained concentration required for great masterworks. Additionally, women seldom seek fame for its own sake. Their ambition is usually confined to the regard of those immediately around them. As long as social institutions systematically distract women and deny them the necessary focus and education, it is premature to judge their capacity for the highest forms of genius. Ethically, the world is often told that women are superior to men in moral goodness, a compliment that usually masks a demand for submission. If women are indeed morally superior, it is a strange logic that assigns the higher nature to a lower social position. In reality, this superiority is often just the result of a training in self-abnegation. Society educates women to live for others, then uses that self-sacrifice to justify their lack of rights. The claim that women are less capable of justice or impartiality is equally suspect. They are taught to cultivate personal affections over abstract principles. If their judgment is sometimes warped by sympathy, men's judgment is just as often warped by self-interest. The remedy lies in expanding the education and social sphere of women, allowing them to appreciate the wider interests of society just as men do. Ultimately, the exclusion of women from the franchise, the right to vote, is a distinct injustice, separate even from the right to hold office. The vote is a means of self-protection, a guarantee that one's interests will not be ignored. Under a free constitution, it is absurd that a woman who manages property and heads a household should be denied a voice in the taxation and laws that govern her, while her male employees or the dullest male neighbor possesses that right. The argument that women do not need the vote because they are represented by their husbands is a fiction. Not all women are married, and those who are often have interests distinct from or opposed to their husbands. To deny women the suffrage is to deny them the status of rational beings entitled to equal consideration in the state. The refusal to admit women to the rights and privileges of citizenship creates a profound dissonance in the modern world, preserving a relic of the law of force in an age that prides itself on justice. By shutting half the human race out of the competition for excellence, society not only commits a grave injustice against women, but deprives itself of a vast pool of talent and energy. The moral and intellectual advancement of humanity is stalled so long as the social relations between the sexes are grounded in privilege rather than equality. Opening all careers and functions to women is not merely a concession to their happiness, but a necessary step toward the improvement of the human race, ensuring that the benefits of civilization are shared by all its members, and that the collective intelligence of society is doubled rather than halved. Chapter 10. There remains a question that, while perhaps less fundamental than the demands of justice, is often asked the most insistently by those whose convictions have been shaken but not yet uprooted. What is the practical advantage of these proposed changes? If the abstract right of women to equality is conceded, the skeptic still demands to know how mankind would benefit from such a social revolution. The answer begins not with a promise of new benefits, but with the cessation of existing evils so vast they are often invisible to the unthinking eye. The sufferings and immoralities born of the subjection of women in marriage are not exceptional cases, but systemic realities. While the most brutal excesses of power may not be the norm among decent men, the law essentially hands women over to the tender mercies of the worst men, with no effective check but public opinion. The persistence of this legal servitude is a monstrous contradiction to every principle of the modern world. The sole remaining instance where a human being in full possession of their faculties is delivered unconditionally into the power of another, creating a bondage that no other legal relationship in civilized society tolerates. Beyond the alleviation of direct suffering, the most universal and pervading advantage of liberating women would be the transformation of the moral character of humanity. The existing relationship between the sexes is the primary school of human character, and currently it is a school of despotism. All the selfish propensities, the self-worship, and the unjust self-preference that plague mankind have their roots in the present constitution of the family. A boy grows up in the belief that, without any merit or exertion of his own, he is by right the superior of an entire half of the human race, including his own mother. This unearned sense of superiority inoculates him with arrogance and obscures the true nature of justice. If the family is to be a school of virtue, it must be a school of sympathy and equality, of living together in love without power on one side or obedience on the other. Only by establishing equality in the most fundamental of social relations can society hope to cultivate the genuine moral sentiment of justice in its citizens, replacing the law of force with the law of right. Furthermore, the continued exclusion of women from the rights of citizenship and the path of professional achievement deprives society of a vast reservoir of intellectual power. By refusing to make use of one half of the whole quantity of talent it possesses, the world suffers an extreme loss. It is not merely that individual women of genius are silenced, but that the general fund of thinking and acting power available for the service of humanity is effectively halved. If women were educated and free to compete in all fields, the result would be a doubling of the mass of mental faculties available for the higher service of mankind. This would not only provide a wider field of selection for public functions, but would also stimulate the intellect of men through competition, forcing them to deserve their positions rather than holding them by the privilege of sex. The mental regeneration of women would thus improve the education of men, creating a cycle of mutual elevation rather than the current dynamic where the stunted development of the wife often acts as a drag upon the aspirations of the husband. This influence of women, even in their present condition, is a powerful reality, but it is often an influence that narrows rather than expands the moral horizon. Because women are confined to the domestic sphere and denied a voice in public concerns, their influence often pulls men away from public virtue and disinterested sacrifice. A man who might be willing to risk his social standing or pecuniary means for a noble cause often finds himself held back by a wife who, understanding only the private interests of the family, views his sacrifice as a dereliction of duty to her and their children. By giving women a stake in the public realm and an education equal to men, this dynamic would change. Women would no longer be the hostages to Mrs. Grundy, enforcing social conformity and mediocrity, but would become partners in the wider interests of humanity. The expansion of women's sphere would thus align their private influence with the public good rather than setting the two in opposition. Finally, there is the most direct benefit of all, the unspeakable gain in private happiness to the liberated half of the species. Freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature, and the denial of it is the most certain source of unhappiness. To be denied the free direction of one's own faculties, to be barred from the pursuits to which one is naturally inclined, is a drying up of the principal fountain of human joy. Many women, particularly those whose children have grown or who have no family duties to occupy them, pine in a state of enforced idleness, conscious of capacities that are never suffered to expand. The dull and hopeless life to which society condemns women of talent is a waste of life that brings with it ennui, melancholy, and a profound dissatisfaction. By opening all careers and offering the same prizes to women as to men, society would not only be more just, but would vastly increase the sum of individual happiness, ensuring that no human being is forced to lead a life that is smaller than their nature. This concluding argument synthesizes the moral, intellectual, and utilitarian cases for equality, positioning the liberation of women not merely as a concession to a specific group, but as the necessary condition for the moral maturity and general happiness of the entire human race. It brings the treatise to a close by affirming that the subjection of women is the last great barrier to the improvement of mankind, and that its removal is the essential next step in the history of civilization.